They say that in polite society, you should never discuss politics, religion, abortion, or the death penalty. So we'll talk about the death penalty right now on the LawWorks.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Closed captioning for the LawWorks is made possible by a grant from the Monongalia County Bar Association and by the Dietzler Family Foundation. People helping people.
The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and by ALPS, providing protection and peace of mind for West Virginia attorneys and their clients since 1988.
Trial lawyers generally enjoy the contest that is a trial, but there's one type of contest they don't particularly enjoy, and that's a death penalty trial. My guests are attorneys L. Richard Walker and J.T. McCamic. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan.
You both try death penalty cases.
That's correct.
In the federal court system primarily. Where does the death penalty come from? I assume in civilization, the history of civilization, we've always killed people, but as a formalized punishment, when did it start?
It's an interesting question, Dan. It is an ancient concept, and it's something that all of the societies that we are familiar with have employed as a penalty. The Egyptians, the Romans, and even in Great Britain, there was a long and sometimes ugly tradition of employing the death penalty in all sorts of ways: burning at the stake, boiling people, drawing and quartering them, and for all different types of offenses. So it's part of our European history that was later, when we settled the United States, transferred to the colonies, to the colonies that made up what is now the United States of America.
In preparing for this program, I did a little reading on the history of the death penalty. And the thing that I found remarkable is certain crimes have always seemed to be punishable by death. Espionage, treason, murder were always, when there was a death penalty, were the kinds of things people were killed for. But there were a lot of other things, and they seem to be very situational, depending upon where that particular society was and what they were doing at the time. In colonial America, for example, stealing grapes, trading with the Indians, things like that were death penalty cases in some colonies, and in other colonies, denying the one true God was a death penalty case. We talk about freedom of religion in settling the colonies. No, sometimes it was pretty strict.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to Shakespeare's time, it depended on back and forth over about a 10 or 20 year period. If you were a Protestant, you were in trouble. And later on, if you're a Catholic, you're in trouble. So you're right, the religion part of it has an overlay to it.
In the United States, as Richard said, we have a complex and varied history of the death penalty, where now in some places, in some states, we have death penalties, in others we don't. There is no death penalty by West Virginia in West Virginia.
That's correct. When the death penalty developed in the United States after we became a country, there was a lack of uniformity, and as you indicated, in the early colonial days, the rules were very varied depending upon what colony you were in, what time period, who was governing that particular colony. But over time, as we became a country, there was some more uniformity. There were a number of reforms that occurred over time. Today, they may not sound like significant reforms, but even the simple transfer of a public hanging, which 200 years ago is how the death penalty was employed, from a public venue into a private venue, was something that states did in order to make the penalty more humane. And of course, There was maybe 100 years ago the development of the first electric chair, which again was an effort to make the process more humane, lethal, the gas chamber, same type of thing. So over time we've seen some changes and really a refinement of the way that the death penalty has been employed. And as a part of that process of change, a lot of states considered making some sweeping changes, and West Virginia was one state that in the 60s did abolish the death penalty in a complete way. I think having practiced in West Virginia for a number of years, Jay knows the history of our death penalty. I've only been practicing in this state for 5 years. I know the history of the Florida death penalty, which we could have probably another show about, but I'll let Jay speak to
Well, we just finished a presidential election. We're going to talk about Florida.
That's fine, but I think Jay really knows how West Virginia has dealt with this topic probably more than I have.
Well, one of the things I find interesting that you just mentioned was that executions used to be a public spectacle.
Right.
And as I understand it, the reason for that was that the ruling entity, whether it was a king or an emperor or a state government, wanted people to see what happened to you if you did these crimes, whatever they happened to be. So as the French did during the French Revolution, it was a big cultural event. Hundreds, thousands of people would assemble to see someone die.
That was a tradition for a long time, and I think the original theory, you're right, it was, I think the image would be people stood solemnly and saw what happened to you if you did a bad thing. What they turned into, emphasis on the word spectacle. It gets so out of hand. I mean, people are hawking their wares, you have people selling trinkets, you have all sorts of things going on. And it just became so out of hand that in West Virginia, I think in something like 1897 or so, it was reported in the New York papers about a particular execution, and it was so grisly, all that behavior, that it sort of set people aback. And they said, wait a minute, we should have this in a more dignified manner. So you have this sort of debate about, well, is it really more humane for the person that's going to ultimately get the penalty, or is this more humane for public at large? They don't have to watch all this terrible sort of grisly spectacle. So you get these sort of private, executions, so to speak. A few witnesses, but that's it.
Well, one of the things I find interesting in the discussions about the death penalty, and concepts of the death penalty have changed a lot over the years. I would say evolved, but I suppose it depends on whether you favor a particular changes, whether you think it's an evolutionary or a step forward. But it's changed. There has been the identification of victims of executions, not just the person who's being put to death, but that person's family, having to witness it or having to experience their family member's death has at sometimes been considered a wrong against them, just the same as the person to be executed had committed a wrong against another person or against society. So there have been many changes, including the way the death penalty is administered. The French, using a guillotine, which was a very disquieting way of execution, did it because they thought that was the most humane way of doing it available at the time. So it was quick, or supposed to be quick. Now we don't know so much. So West Virginia did away with the death penalty in the 1960s. What did we replace it with?
Well, we have a system that replaces it with the most highest penalty that you can get, being life in prison without parole, which is the standard sort of default penalty if you're not going to have the death penalty in various states. Right now there's 14 states that do not have the death penalty, along with D.C. Being the 15th, I guess. Very recently, New Jersey joined that group. West Virginia, as mentioned, has been in that group since 1965. Hewlett Smith was a governor. Interestingly, he was very open about his opposition to the death penalty, which nowadays many politicians sort of see as a very bad thing to be against the death penalty, because it shows you're sort of not manly, or you're not macho, or you can't be in firm control of governing bodies or whatever. Clinton, for instance, during his campaign, first campaign, stopped his campaign to go back to sign the death warrant of an individual in Arkansas, and made much public to do about that. our current governor said that he's for the death penalty, even though it's not an issue. It comes up as sort of a litmus test of how tough you are. So it's kind of interesting that there's 14 states, and New Jersey just joined it.
Well, the death penalty issue in West Virginia comes up, I would say every year, but I don't think it's every year. It comes up from time to time. There's a move to reinstate the death penalty. So far, it has failed. But why? Some years ago, I practiced with an attorney who had been in the state legislature from 1952 up until the mid-'80s. And he always told me that the thing that was most influential to him in voting to abolish the death penalty and then in opposing the reinstitution of it was the cost of executing somebody. Why is it more expensive to execute somebody than to lock them away for the rest of their life?
Well, it's largely litigation costs, basically. You have the natural desire of the courts to make sure you get it right. So you have more expense in allowing things such as experts and quality legal representation. You have an appeal process. Some states have an automatic appeal to their Supreme Court if you have a death penalty case. So sort of built into this system is a lot of costs because, we don't want to make mistakes. And recently, of course, we've seen the Innocence Project and the DNA situation where you say, wait a minute, we got it wrong here. So-and-so has been convicted, and we've now been able to show that actually this person didn't do it. So there's all that sort of care and caution that are put into it. So over time, through that system, the costs are much more than just putting somebody in prison for life when you actually compare the two.
But you can count on a couple of sets of hands the number of people that have been cleared of having committed a murder through things like DNA, can't you? It's not thousands of people.
No, but it's more than a couple of sets of hands. I mean, it's pushing. I didn't look at that. It changes almost daily. You can go to the website, innocence.org. I think it's close to 200, 180 some or something like that.
We're in the area of 200 now, and that brings up, well, of course, in the context of the death penalty debate, many people will argue that, one innocent life taken through a prosecution that for whatever reason, because of irregularities or insufficiency of proof or ineffective attorneys, whatever the reason, if there's one life that's taken that shouldn't have been taken, many people argue that is a cost that is too great. And the second point that I'd like to bring up in this regard is that we know of 200 people who have been exonerated through post-conviction DNA testing. But those 200, of course, constitute only individuals who have not already been executed, and they also are made up of a group that, fortunately for them, have had DNA evidence preserved in their case. So now 10 or 15 years after the fact, it can be tested or retested through more sophisticated means. There may be, well, there certainly are many others who could have DNA tested had those samples been preserved in some way. Now, unfortunately, we can only deal with those who do have that evidence still available for testing. So 200 is a number that we can point to. There could be many more.
Richard actually brings up a good point, because people tend to focus on DNA because that's an obvious scientific test where you can look at it and it's objective test. But these cases normally don't deal with DNA. And in fact, the first federal death penalty case after Furman came back in the 70s, or Gregg came back in the 70s, was Chandler, U.S. versus Chandler. And it went back and forth through the courts forever until President Clinton finally commuted the sentence to life in prison because it was such a mess. And the reason why it was a mess, it's a classic case of who did what. You have co-defendants, got a deal, and testified against the other co-defendant. And then they backed out of it and said, no, it didn't really happen that way, and back and forth. And so how do you measure that with a test? There's no test, a truth test. Is the guy telling the truth that is getting the deal, sort of thing.
Unfortunately, one of the things that happens in some capital crime cases. When we talk about a capital crime, that's a crime that is punishable either by death or by life in prison. We don't distinguish between those two when we group cases like that. But in capital crime cases where the death penalty is a possibility, there have been allegations that co-defendants will agree to testify against other people in order to avoid the death penalty. Either, Mr. McCamic, you testify against Mr. Walker, or we're going to put you on trial subject to the death penalty. And the fear is that that's going to convince you to be less than completely truthful. In fact, to lie about what you know about Mr. Walker to save your own life. And that sort of thing does happen.
Sure. The temptation is great. It happens in much smaller cases over, whether you're going to go to prison for a few years. People tend to get a little imaginative on what they think they saw. If their prison sentence is going to be less, imagine what it is if you're actually facing death. So, yeah, sure. It's tough to gauge that, like we've been talking about. There's no magic test, but you can go back and look at the Chandler case as the example I used before. It's just the guy's story changed every time he told it. When he told it in front of the jury one way and got a conviction. Later on he said, no, I don't think so. And then back it went, back and forth. So it's a big problem.
But the number of executions in the United States in the last several years has been going up, and fairly dramatically if you look at the total numbers year by year by year. But it seems studies indicate that public opinion favoring the death penalty or disfavoring the death penalty have come together, and they're pretty much even now. The country, we hear all the time, is split on things, and capital punishment seems to be one of those things. It's hard to say that there is a national consensus about it, but on an international scale, there is a very definite consensus about it.
That's true. Our statistics have sort of ebbed and flowed. Back in the 60s, it was somewhere around 60% for the death penalty. It's gone back a little bit, roughly 50-50, increasing. People have studied it as to the heyday of the death penalty in our country was in the 1930s. We had the Depression. There was a lot of poverty and a lot of things going on that caused people to almost get into that spectacle mode. Everybody was watching gangster movies, whatever it is. And it was very popular. I've forgotten the statistics exactly, but I know it was very high during that period. Into the 1960s started to flow back. So Europe, they've had it, like Richard was talking about, England, et cetera, the French, had it for a long time and basically gave it up. And that happens with our states too. Like Massachusetts, for instance, is a non-death state. But I think it was 1968, right before Furman, they had a statewide referendum and voted it in. And so Colorado, at one time early in the 1800s, voted it out. Now they are a death state. So it sort of ebbs and flows. I really don't have an answer on sort of public opinion or why that is, but I just know it is.
And New Jersey is an interesting example because it's current. I think before New Jersey made its decision late in 2007 to abolish the death penalty in that state, the last state to abolish it was West Virginia, and I think we said 1963, something along those
65,
lines.
I think.
65. Yeah. And remember that in New Jersey, this was not something that was put to a public referendum. In other words, the question wasn't whether the majority of the population in the state of New Jersey agrees on this specific issue that it should not exist in that state. Instead, the legislature evaluated it, and one of their simple findings was that it's not working, and that it was not actually a deterrent, or there was no concrete proof that for the purposes of that state, it was a deterrent to violent crime. Once you make the determination as a state governing body that this penalty, which is, of course, the most serious that we know of, doesn't serve a purpose of deterrence, then clearly, of course, given the cost that we already discussed, the question is, should we let it continue as a penalty in our particular state? And the state of New Jersey decided no, that it simply wasn't effective and therefore was not a worthwhile procedure for its justice system. So it was important to note, I think, in the New Jersey situation that it wasn't simply that people disagreed with it or they didn't like it or they found it to be uncomfortable or something that was morally objectionable. They found that it didn't work. So it was more pragmatic than perhaps we would initially believe.
The general argument about that is people who commit murder generally do it as an emotional response to a situation without forethought, despite the fact that we may convict them of first-degree murder, which is premeditated murder. In a courtroom, a jury's instructed that premeditation can be like that or even less than that. It can be just a millisecond. The person who's going to commit the crime recognizes what they're going to do and makes an affirmative decision to do it. And that's premeditation. It doesn't have to be something that you scheme for a week to do or for a minute to do or even for a second to do. But studies by people who do studies, whomever they may be, seems to indicate that people who commit murder are not deterred from committing it by the suggestion that they may die as a result. We're talking about states eliminating capital punishment. Just very recently, on November 12th of 2008, the Maryland Commission on Capital Punishment voted to recommend repealing the death penalty in Maryland. Now, it hasn't been repealed there, but still there is a movement in some states to eliminate the death penalty. If we don't have the death penalty, what do we say to people when they look at the most horrific of crimes? When a family is murdered or when somebody is tortured and then murdered, the kinds of crimes that make us all sick to our stomach. And we're going to say, no, that person, not you, that person is worthy of dying, but we're just not going to do that. Isn't that where the public outcry to support the death penalty comes from? It's just sometimes we just have to do that.
I think so. I mean, I think it's, all of us have a natural sort of visceral reaction to a homicide or to somebody being harmed. You know, when you're a little kid on the playground and you see somebody get really, really hurt by a bully, you know, your visceral reaction is, you know, attack the bully. You know, that person should be punished physically. But, you know, we've sort of evolved, if we were talking about the whole history of this, and we don't take people out and stone them, or back before that, take their entire family out and stone them if one of their members was guilty of a homicide. So you have to start thinking about how are we going to deal with homicide. Now, we're lucky in West Virginia that we have one of the lowest crime rates in the country. We haven't had the death penalty since 1965. I'm not sure those two things are related. Statisticians would probably argue with me if they're not, if they were pro-death penalty. So, you know, how do we deal with it? Well, we have life without parole. You, guilty of a homicide, call it depraved, call it whatever language, grisly, whatever language you want to use, life without parole. And it gets into this odd calculus. You know, what is a depraved or heinous, and you use all these different terminologies. Crime. Now we have someone who's obviously mentally deranged that does some horrible things to the body afterwards or something, you know. Is that worse than somebody who calmly and coolly holds a gun to your head and says, I want you to tell me about your life, and I want you to pray, and I want you to do this and do that, and then pull the trigger? Which one's more heinous?
And those kinds of events do occur.
Occasionally they do. The usual homicide, I think, is, as you described earlier, you know, it's an emotional reaction. There's something going on, an amalgam of stupidity and drugs or alcohol and a robbery gone bad or those kinds of things. But so Europe and a large, in our state, large group of people have decided, look, life in prison's good enough, you know, throw away the key.
And I'd like to make a couple of points in response to your question, which I think is a very good one. We all have a negative reaction to these terrible crimes that occur. And we have strong feelings about what we think as individuals should happen to the person who commits the crime. But of course, the death penalty doesn't undo the crime. And think that's an important point for us to consider as attorneys and members of the justice system. We can never undo the crime, no matter how terrible it is, with the death penalty. We also have to recognize as a civilized society that the law is not about vengeance. And though we may have a reaction as human beings, just a natural reaction that occurs when we see these crimes happening, there should be a difference between our natural, innate, animalistic reaction to a crime and how we think a justice system should be administered. The law should not be about vengeance, in my opinion.
You get the last word. Jay McCamic, Richard Walker, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you also for being with us on behalf of the Law Works. I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. If you want to know if you need a lawyer, you can discuss your problems with a lawyer by calling the West Virginia State Bar Helpline, toll-free Tuesday evenings from 6 to 8 at 1-800-642-3617. On the LawWorks webpage at thelawworks.org, you'll find a complete listing of all the LawWorks show topics, information on how to obtain copies of the program, and additional information about this show's topic. You'll also find a list of legal resources that can help answer your legal questions. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future The LawWorks show, you can send us email to thelawworks@comcast.net.
The Law Works is produced in cooperation with the West Virginia State Bar, the Mountain State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The Law Works is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the West Virginia Association for Justice, and by ALPS, providing protection and peace of mind for West Virginia attorneys and their clients since 1988.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.